Ladies and gentlemen, it is time for our first keynote speaker, that is Professor Emeritus Soumitra Sharma. Professor Sharma was educated at the University of Agra. He earned his PhD in economics from the University of Zagreb in 1967. Professor Sharma served economic faculty of Zagreb University until 2002, when he joined faculty in Pula. He has been a guest exchange professor at various prestigious universities in the US, Europe, Japan, China, and Australia. His major works are Economic Development and World Debt, Growth and External Debt Management, Development Policy, Macroeconomic Management, Restructuring in Eastern Europe, Microeconomics of Transition Process, John Maynard Keynes, Keynesianism in 21st Century, About Economics and Economists, Reflections on the Philosophical Foundations of Economics, Economics in a Awkward Corner, and currently Professor Soumitra Sharma is Senior Editor of the Journal of Philosophical Economics and Social Sciences. Please welcome.
My dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, most of you know me very well for the last 20 or 45 years. It's my pleasure to present some of my recent thoughts on a subject which has been long shadowed with doubts and ignorance. But before I do that, I would like to remind you that most of you have already been informed that I will be convening an international conference from all the continents of the world in New Delhi vicinity, a reputed, relatively new university, Meerut University in Meerut city is about 70 kilometers from Indira Gandhi Airport, where I expect you people to arrive. I have with me another Sharma, Professor Sudhir Sharma. He will be our host. And I have invited him to come to us and see all of us how we are doing this conference, so it might help him to organize the conference in his university. Next year, I expect you to participate from November 26th to 29th or 30. And of course, I expect from all of you a written paper relating to the themes that I have already announced, and most probably you have got in your bags a sheet telling about it. But if anybody wants to have further information, they should kindly contact me in near future through email or personally or in any other alternative mode. Now let me come to my theme. I must request you a little more patience because it will last long. And in order to avoid that I'll get lost in my thoughts and drive away from the basic theme, I have written down, so I will be reading out some part of my talk, and the complete, I would say rather incomplete, unedited draft of my talk is already on the internet, and hopefully it will, after I get some serious criticisms from you, will be revised, and I hope that from you all people I get the real criticism, not just say, well, it was good, that I know that it is good. But the fact is that the revision of the text is practically every day. I write 1 or 2 sentences every day, every now and then when I'm reading the text, I just make alterations. So please be patient, and I would request you not to quote from that draft until it is finalized. It will be available to you, and most probably it will take a small book form in very near future. Now, I have selected the theme, Civilization's Unholy Trinity in between philosophy, religion, economics, and I have added that this trinity is not trinity, it's a quark. And I will show you by some illustration and by some arguments that the trinity was quite unholy. And my arguments are maybe not widely accepted, but I have my fundamental thesis and belief that the Trinity that was established 3,500 years before Christ are untrue. The Trinity was not holy, it was quite unholy, and so on and so forth. Now, at the first glance, it looks like that my theme has absolutely no connection with the themes that we are going to discuss in our conference. But the fact is, I see something different. And I should say that, first of all, let me say that there are 2 fundamental theses that I believe in, and I have come to understand quite late in my life. First is that human history is an excellent teacher, and one can learn quite a lot from it. It is continuous. It has no gaps. If at all there are gaps, it's in our knowledge. And if we want to learn from something, we have to explore our history. Nothing begins from us. It was already there. You look at the history of grand civilizations, which I have presented in a form here, the geographical region at the zenith of any particular time, well-known philosophers at that time, main religion of that time, and the major deities in those systems, and major advances in technology that were there. And still, as I said, I am exploring. I suddenly found that the flying machine, which you might call today a helicopter, was invented 2,500 years before. Rig Veda tells about it. It flew the hero of the famous epic Ramayana from Sri Lanka to his capital town in the north of India. So nothing is absolutely new. It is always there, and I'm going to prove it. Now, as I said, at first sight, it might seem to you that the theme of my expose is quite out of context to the subject of today. To me, past and future are very much related. To look at the future, one needs to look at the past. It is just like driving a car forward and eyeing on the front mirror for traffic at the back. My paper relates to ancient history of human civilizations that had existed at their zenith at around 3100 BC until the Christian era, and were considered great for one or other reason. For example, vastly covered geographical area, their military might, their economic growth and trade relations, efficient public administration, for their deliverance of socio-economic welfare to larger sections of people, their contribution to architecture, science, technology, or their cultural legacy, etc. For that, everybody thinks that they were great. From ancient history, I have learned that humans have consistently fought to create a better future. Visions of intellectuals, rulers, men of faith, and business people have helped shape civilization to progress. But underneath this progress were also sown the seeds of their downfall. The future visions of endless progress, abruptly, in relative sense, ended for reasons of war, natural disasters, poor social political management of societies, etc. As continuity and recovery are natural process, again and again these civilizations started rebuilding, but their past determined their future. And rarely any civilization rose to its glorious past. Progress of any civilization depends upon its vision for the future. It implies designing of an employing of a strategy of set of targets, instruments to meet these targets, a time frame, and a congenial environment for its attainment. If all these preconditions were met, the stage was set for an optimal restart. However, unfortunately, history doesn't provide facts to prove this, that it did happen. Today, we have gathered here to discuss the future of the world by 2050. I'm sure my learned friends have some bright visionary picture for the coming future. I'm sure that in your visions and models, you have considered the constraints as well. That might eventually shadow your scenario. If you have not, please do so and consider them. Now let me turn to my theme. By consulting an extensive literature and deep thinking, I have come to understand that throughout the history of civilizations, there had existed a very strong bond between philosophy, religion, and economic activity of the day. It has been called the Holy Trinity. I want to put forward my thesis that this Trinity was practically, in practice, unholy. Following are my arguments. Now you have three figures. The first is the ancient version of the Trinity, three different fields: economics, philosophy, and religion. And there was always, it is historically proven, a struggle for supremacy or dominance. Either the pontiff or the businessman or the philosopher ruled. You have different examples in ancient times. Of course, I am still working on finding their exact names, dates, etc. Therefore, I am not in a position to suggest you at this time. As all of you know, I have produced a book which is called The Philosophical Foundations of Economics. I have dealt the problem of Trinity little more in detail there. Therefore, I am not going to talk about it. And the Trinity is that there was always a struggle for supremacy. Even in current days, you can look at it from now on, backwards, if you just say, take Donald Trump. He's a big businessman, he's the political leader, and now he dominates the scene in the United States. In nearby Italy, in the Middle Ages, you had the Medici family. 500 years they have ruled. They were businessmen. Similarly, in Sumerians, the businessmen declared themselves as the rulers, and finally they converted themselves. Instead of the natural gods, they became the human gods. Military rulers, or politicians you may call, they had also dominated the scene from time to time. Take the case of Caesar Augustus. Augustus was a military leader, and he converted himself into an established Caesar, and later declared himself as the god. And temples were constructed, and we have in one Pula temple where the worship was done in the name of Augustus Caesar. So you have always have that sort of trinity and struggle for power who will dominate out of the three, either the business or the economics or the businessman or the philosopher. Now, for philosopher, you have a lot of philosophers. This is not a case of Aristotle or Plato, no. But in fact, some philosophers, for example, in India, in 321 BC, after Alexander went away, the philosopher who was adamant to destroy the empire of the emperor in India took a child, his name was Chandragupta Maurya, and put him on a small kingdom as a child, 14-year-old child. And he was a philosopher. He has produced a book as well, the first textbook in political economy. You can learn it. You have copies in our library in Pula, and you can see that it was produced, Principles of Functioning of Society and Economics at the same time. Now, he was a philosopher, but he himself was very much adamant to grab the power, and he put the child, and in his name he ruled through his lifetime as the exact ruler of the great empire, which was as large from borders of Afghanistan all the way in the northern and southern India to Bay of Bengal and so on. So you have examples in history where philosophers wanted to dominate through the kings or the emperors by being their advisors. You have still many examples in the modern world that the philosophers become advisors to the government, advisors to the president, but they rule from behind. I have known some Nobel laureates who were in the team in the earlier administration, right from Kennedy all the way to the current administration. So philosophers have dominated, so have the economists, so have the religious pontiffs. You have now today living figures, the Dalai Lama. He is the head of the state as well as the religious leader of the Buddhist, and of course the state doesn't exist, it is Tibet. And you have in the Middle Ages, the Roman Pope used to bless the kings, and Charles the Great was crowned by the Holy Pope. So practically at all times, these three figures had fought for their dominance and supremacy. It is rather easy to imagine that at one time, this is my first argument as contra, it is rather easy to imagine that at one time in all civilizations, in principle, at least theoretically, in an ideal cooperative relationship would have existed. Scholars have claimed that there had existed such an ideal symbiosis in between philosophy, religion, and economics. Historical details and events, however, do not support this contention. To my mind, the ideal virtual relationship seemingly was a pure thought that there is a trinity. And philosophical minds, as the philosopher, must have believed that it should and it could exist in any civilization, for it will ensure a perfect harmony and functioning of the socio-economic order, and moral and ethical standards will be preserved. Wars, natural disasters, intense suffering by people are not the grounds enough to disturb the harmony. Logically conceived, this ideal triangular relationship was envisaged to be manifested in individual human minds through I consciousness. Now, what is I consciousness? About I consciousness, we have first evidence in Bible. When Moses goes to the hilltop, light emerges and the God speaks. And he asks, "Who are you?" And he says, "I am Yahweh, your God." And he gives the 10 Commandments, and then this is. So you have evidence there. You look at the ancient Indian civilization, the so-called Vedas and Upanishads exactly repeat the same thing in 2500 BC, even much before than we have come to discuss it. Later, all the philosophers, Greeks, Germans, Indians, have analyzed this I consciousness in between. I have a funny example of it, and the example relates to different questions. One is the existence of God. Does the God exist or not? It's a matter of personal belief, which becomes faith. Many of us formally believe in God, but they don't worship. Many of us are extraordinarily conscious of the existence of God, and they worship Him in many ways, in all different religions. And another thing which is associated with the existence of God is the I consciousness. Now, I narrated an example in India this year when I just went there. Every human soul at the time of birth has no breath. In German, Kant has and Hegel have discussed this question, that when the child is born, he has got no atma. Atma is a Sanskrit word for soul. And the Germans have borrowed the philosophy from the ancient Aryan Rig Veda, and they say that Atman, which is Atma, is breath. The translation of German word Atman is breath. So when the child is born, he is not breathing. He comes out of mother's womb, and the medical attendant holds him or her from the leg and pat on the back. And the child makes a cry. Wah. And I have translated it. This is the Sanskrit word Om, I am. He is reporting his arrival in the world to the God and says, I am, oh God, I have come here. And when anybody dies, nobody remembers anybody else, anything else, but just say, oh God. That means the God must exist right from the birth until death. If not during the lifetime, he remembers the God. So there is an eternal soul. Philosophy treats this question, soul and spirit and matter or soul, and all these are the subjects of philosophy we have heard with. Now, when we say the question of I consciousness, everybody, when I ask you who you are, you say, I am so and so. That means it's right from the birth, the question of I consciousness is there, and you present yourself with a particular name. And for example, in India, one believes that there is a reincarnation, so the soul never dies. It's permanent. It goes on reincarnating, and every time the child is born, he is a reincarnation of some of his predecessors or his former life. So when we talk about I consciousness, then I have just thought of I think. What is it? I think. It means I'm just taking care of my mind, and I'm churning in the mind, this can be identified as philosophy. When I say, I believe, in the sense of God, then I believe or I don't believe. So it's a question of faith, and it's the part which the religions deals with. And when I say I want, that is pure economics. I want food, I want water, so it is a question of body. So if you can just think of its mind, heart, and the stomach. These are the three fundamental things, and therefore the philosophers thought of that, the so-called trinity. Every part of body was taken care of ideologically, philosophically by the pontiffs, philosophers, and so on and so forth. Now my second argument is that let us assume a hypothetical scenario. It would be logical for me to assume that these fundamental questions must have first taken roots in philosophers' mind. Since philosophers are never taken seriously and often branded as crazy and even sentenced to death for their noble ideas, take the case of Socrates, they must have tried to win over and convince the rulers in the support of their ideas. And this has happened in history a couple of times. This must have made possible that in some great civilizations, philosophers, intellectuals became close advisors to the rulers, and some basic ideas of these intellectual minds were implemented, maybe with limited success. It is also logical to assume that above-mentioned aspect must have had in focus the common human socio-economic behavior, and therefore easy to assume that the preservation of moral, ethical, and values was possible, and philosophers and rulers must have also sought the help of religious leaders to convince the masses, for they commanded immense influence and respect, that these issues must have become a fertile breeding ground for the future generations. Look at the figure 2. The state is the umbrella institution covering all these sections, and downwards there are the people. And I have just put farmers and businessmen because at that time there was no industry. But they were having divided loyalties to either of these three sections. Some were extremely religious. For them, everything was religious pontiff. Others were believing in the philosophy. Those intellectuals, academics, they believed what the philosophers are saying, and economics, what the business people are doing. So in fact, the religions have dealt with certain fundamental questions such as creation, existence, fate, justice, money redistribution, and God, etc. This has always been in context to the preservation of social order through search of truth, spirit, and good. Naturally, both the philosophers and priests have approached these themes scientifically and with reason. In philosophical and religious domain, some of these questions have dominated, such as the existence of God, I consciousness, matter and spirit, self, moral values, etc. By a simple conjecture, one can assume that in the interest of preserving and a smooth functioning of the social order, these issues were interpreted as per personal affinities and whims of intellectuals, rulers, priests. Judges were appointed by the rulers to sort out disputes and sanction the offenders. Forced labor, levies, land or crop ownership, high interest rates, widespread temple prostitution, merciless punishment for crimes were not uncommon instruments of repression. Egyptian, Sumerian, and Chinese history is full of such examples. Religious leaders, either the king themselves or the priests, have tried to establish theocratic state and considered themselves as the representative God on earth. There were the regional and city gods, Mostly the priests had declared themselves as the gods, and in reality they were the kings, the human ruler, simply as representative of gods. The deification of the kings carried on leads to a logical conclusion that they did rule in the name of God. Conversely, high priest of one of the larger temples used to be a person of great political importance, as was often chosen from the royal house. That was the case of Egypt. Temple and state were so inextricably mingled that while the state has to be regarded as theocracy, the temple must be regarded as the political institution, and the state religion as a political instrument. Civil and ecclesiastical offices were not clearly distinguished in the past. Third argument, one can think that in the past history there must have existed a variety of models of this close relationship of intellectuals, rulers, priests, and even business lords that were adopted in different civilizations and at different times. Historical proof suggests that these forms varied from intense collusion to intense competition or enmity to the extent of war or bureaucratic tyranny. For example, in times of Egyptian pharaohs, the early Chinese emperors of Shi and Chu, the misery was intolerable. The warlords and ritual blessings of the god representative, the priests, and of course with financial support of business class, waged wars of invasion. Thutmose III, 1479 to 1425 BC in Palestine. Darius the Great, all the way up to Turkey. Alexander the Great, up to the border of India, Afghanistan. Against such a collusive model, common was that of the intense rivalry in fighting for dominance in the society. Philosophers, intellectuals, advisors, in rivalry with the priests, usually stood by the political rulers, who usually also had a large armies at their disposal. At times, priests have the support of the masses, declared themselves as rulers. In such cases, a conflict would have been imminent. The conflict did arise. Who won, we can only guess and look for historical examples. Fourth argument, to qualify for a great ancient civilization, there must be a successful, flourishing, and well-organized economy. Although every economy functions by its own laws, it is also governed by social and moral values, for example, tax and property laws, and religious beliefs, for example, charity, rejection of interest rate by Islam, for example, and target goals of the society. Accordingly, it has to devise a particular economic model. For example, the command economy of Egyptian type, autocratic model of the early Chinese emperors, or open economy like that of the Sumerians. For any civilization, the symbol of prosperity, among others, is its gross monetary and real asset, and the income-wealth structure of the population. In ancient civilizations, money, that means bullions, coin, jewels, had been synthetic indicator of wealth of a nation. Its growth was measured in terms of output of primary sector and its international trade. Its sustainability over a long period showed its strength. The quality of life, occupational structure, level of poverty and income distribution, infrastructure, trade, organization of bureaucracy, urbanization, etc. are some of the litmus test indicators of the level of advancement of any society. Accordingly, all ancient civilizations that were considered to have been great must have these mentioned tests. Unfortunately, very little economic data is available on these mentioned issues. Thus, it is difficult to make any comparable study. What we can learn from history is that unusual rates of that the annual rate of growth was in most civilizations around 0 and constantly low. In some cases, it reached up to 0.75% per annum. Farming, animal husbandry, carpentry, fishing, international trade evidently contributed to a major share of national incomes. Riches were shared among rulers, bureaucrats, traders who commanded the wealth, property, and trade of any country. Even today, the Queen of England goes to the London city and kneels in front of the traders as a tradition to support for the war chest in the past. Common people, that are the farmers and the laborers, toiled and suffered from hunger and poverty, low living standards, exploitation, high interest rate on loans, and high taxes. So now I ask myself, and what was so great to admire about these the so-called great civilizations? Every economy in periods depend upon the state of technology. Technology, precedence of a civilization over other in any given period of time is an indicator of its advance. In history, every civilization at one time or the other has technological edge over others. This edge was demonstrated in its science, that is astronomy, mathematics, geometry, medicine, architecture, philosophy, logic, ethics, metaphysics, etc. Archaeological and anthropological and historical studies demonstrate that most of these civilizations have contributed their fair share at one time or the other. The only question is why the progress in science and technology as compared to modern age was so slow. Why was the second industrial revolution after 4,500 years after the first discovery of the charity wheel? Was there a lack of inventive minds? I say no. Or the pattern of the society intentionally kept it at low levels because that would have made their dominant position easy. Why the thoughtful mind did not help in this process is the question that needs to be explored. Now, as the conclusion, I would say that all civilizations had grown, stagnated, or declined in their path of continuity over time. So had their history. There were no gaps. The gaps are in only our knowledge about certain time periods, which, unfortunately, we know little about. Some of these civilizations have come to be known as great for achievements in art, architecture, geometry, literature, mathematics, medicine, philosophy, warfare. But we must notice that contributions were, although remarkable, but marginal in terms of products of intellectual minds, philosophers of science. In terms of numbers, these minds were only few per tens of millions and appeared rarely on a time scale. I would like to argue that it is logical to assume that throughout the ancient age, the holders of the so-called Holy Trinity bothered little about the fate of the common masses. The political system, ruling elite, and the business leader took most care of their vested interest only. There were revolutions from time to time, but were crushed mercilessly, and eventually these might have brought only restricted reforms. The resulting advancement of societies was based on the unethical, unjust relationship based upon desire of dominance, power struggle, conflict, repression, religious manipulations of masses, poverty accompanied with unequal distribution of incomes and wealth, forced labor, and so on. Thus, the question in my mind arises as to how such a relation can be called holy, therefore, and on what grounds it can be defended. Therefore, I declare this Trinity as unholy. And instead of that, my version is the figure number 3, which says that the technology is one of the elements which has been discarded by the ancient scholars. But it is present. As I narrated, in all civilizations, there were some technological advancements from one level to another. But we know very little about. I was reading something, and suddenly in a book on the Chinese economy during the war, the times of emperors, say around 1600, they had robots. When I just mentioned to somebody, and so people said, how happened Chinese could have 1600 years before robots? So it's not new. If there was a flying machine which could take the King Rama from Sri Lanka to there must have existed some sort of technology which was functioning. On what basis, I really don't know. But you cannot just discard the historical facts which are evident. And therefore, I added the fourth pillar of our... and further, now, from current point of view, you just look, the struggle for dominance or supremacy. Now, we are advancing towards the age of digital knowledge, and we would come to a situation where there will be technology is going to be supreme, and we will have our worst enemy, the robots and the technology in future time. So we will get, still today, I mean, I'm abhorred with the idea everybody having mobile phone sitting in front of you instead of having coffee and a talk for which you have come looking at both or three, all the members around the table are just doing this. So we are going to have a fight for supremacy of human being against machines and technology and so on and so forth. And I sometimes, when I travel to India, I meet quite a lot of our local Istrian people traveling to India. They practice yoga. And I said, how do happen you are going to all the way to Rajasthan for and he says, I have everything. I have property, I have a house, I have everything, but I am just looking for the consolence of soul. Therefore, my dear colleagues and friends, and I would very much appreciate if you have some fundamental criticism of my logic of thinking. I would very much entertain. But since I'm hard on hearing, we can only talk outside after the over. But I would entertain your criticism. Thank you very much for listening.